left. Welcome to, what week is this? 11? 12? I think it's 11. Doesn't matter. We're doing Iranian cinema. We're talking about Abbas Kiarostami. I guess in terms of kind of key points, and then I'll kind of get into a sort of a small introduction about the stuff. But first, Iranian cinema is interesting because historically where we're at, in other words, our relationship to Iran and the Middle East, right? And so, I think this is going to be consistently, especially in these last few weeks, sort of structuring, undergirding basic question, but the question of Orientalism and how we imagine the Middle East, right, is sort of central. And it's interesting for me because, being someone trained in film studies, having gone through grad school studying cinema, Kiarostami is a very canonical sort of filmmaker, just as canonical, maybe more, maybe less than any of the other filmmakers we've watched. And I, to be fair, like, I know that people discuss this, like, I'm not gonna behave as if it's probably my own due diligence for not having studied hard enough. Sorry to my teachers. And also just not doing enough research. But at least I don't remember in my grad, sort of training, really hearing sufficient discussion about what seems like a sort of dissonance between the fact that Kiarostami is so beloved, but we don't really talk about, the fact that we're still, at war, and that Iran is, the relationship that the U.S. has with Iran. There's this kind of, just doesn't mismatch. And so, I do think, to be fair, that, with the readings that we have this week, and again, probably just like the general, and judging from the readings, because, these are, I think, very indicative of the kind of discourse around Kiarostami, so I should kind of rephrase or revise. I think a lot of people grapple with that, or that's the importance of watching international cinema and someone like Kiarostami, is that something like Taste of Cherry or The Wind Will Carry Us really does get us to question our kind of notions and ideas about other people. And I don't mean just other people around the world, but other people that we identify as other people, that we say have a substantially different way of life than we do, across the board, even in the U.S., even my neighbors, right? And I think that's, it'll come up, especially in Thursday's reading, this idea of I think the readings this week are the ones where I remember seeing so far this semester the word like humanism come up, or humanitarian. So we'll talk about that quite a bit. Two, the question of criticality, and I've been teaching for longer than you might think. I hit the same beats every semester. Some of you will, I hope all of you, but some of you will come to know this, but some of you are leaving us, right? So I wish I had gotten here sooner, but and it's to the point that students have joked about my kind of obsession with critical thinking, and it's one of those interesting things. That I don't think I really have. I have like versions of it. Of like, it's this, and it's that, and it's this, and in that sense, it's very similar to Orientalism, where it's like, Said, if you read Orientalism, he gives multiple definitions, but there's not like one working kind of compact, perfect sort of form. Critical thinking is like that for me. And it's very similar to what I was talking about after the first screening, where it's like, let's not focus on what it's not, right? Let's focus on what it is, like the sort of negative versus positive sense. In a similar sense, like critical thinking is often, I know what it's not, right? It's much harder to say what it is. And I'm bringing that up because we're doing a reading by Jonathan Rosenbaum, who's not an academic, but one of the kind of sort of most central American film critics, you know, still working. And so in that sense, I do want you to kind of explicitly think about the criticality of film criticism, of professional film criticism, as opposed to the criticality of like film scholarship, because those two things aren't the same thing. Which also means that for this reading, that you and I have to put in a little bit more work in trying to kind of put Rosenbaum in dialogue with the other filmmaker or other writers, right? And the other things that and the other ideas. That's not to say, of course, you know, Rosenbaum is a much more sophisticated film reader than I am. It almost goes without saying. It's kind of silly to even say, but that doesn't mean that he has all bases covered either. So that's kind of what I want you to think about. You know, so that's really kind of right now. Well, actually, like, you know, just to kind of sort of let's expand on this a little bit while we're here. That I'll just kind of prime us to say that the kind of the sophistication of his descriptions, right? Because that is one of the main things that you have to do when you're writing these things, is that in analyzing a film or a sequence, you have to describe it, you know, rhetorically, right, with prose, and that is a skill that you need to cultivate, right? How do you convey that? Because, and you get to learn this, and you may have to a certain degree already, is that like, you're going to read things about films that you haven't watched and or probably won't even, you know, won't watch, right? And that's okay. Like, that's part of the like learning process of all of this. That like reading about film is, to me, is as important and sometimes even more important than actually watching the film, right? And so film scholars do not write with the idea that everyone will have written or seen the film that they're talking about. Oftentimes, they will not have. So how do you communicate that? I mean, you need to kind of really beef up your description. Relatedly, you know, his analysis, and I think Annika, you mentioned this on the discussion board, but you know, the narrative analysis too, because that's on some level, almost fundamentally, that's really what Rosenbaum is doing here. And then the reading on Thursday does as well, where it's just, it is narrative thematic analysis. This scene means this, this does this, and sort of aggregately these do these. That's really kind of what's going on, right? But also, just like incredibly impressive formal analysis, right? And so in that sense, you know, kind of what Rosenbaum really is doing is, it's as opposed to what a lot of the authors we've read so far, which is really kind of putting kind of sort of the sort of expanding the context, right, historically especially. Rosenbaum's doing that too, for sure, especially intertextually, right? This is how it relates to other films. This connects to this, that sort of thing, right? But it's much more akin to the kind of analysis that we're already used to, right? Like the sort of, you know, like in terms of, like almost literarily, right? Like almost literary analysis, right? Themes, motifs, significance, right? Like what the story's doing. And I guess in relation to this, kind of, some terms that I like to use when we're thinking about critical thinking is, you know, insight. What is the insight provided, right? And so in this case, like the insight is kind of much more I would kind of dare say abstract a little bit more, very similar, you know, like this is what we can learn about the human condition, you know, this is something that gets us to think, you know, about other people. So, you know, like philosophically too, sure. And also another term that I like is explanatory power. This is why another kind of keyword, which is just as critical to me as critical thinking as the idea of theory or critical theory, is that the theory theorizes a phenomenon and explains, provides an explanation. So, like, what is the explanatory power of a given theory or a given piece? What is the insight produced? That's why something like, for me, Said's Orientalism is a gift that, excuse me, keeps on giving. You know, I can't stop talking about this book, you know, probably 10 years after I first read it or heard about it, right? So in that sense, like, thinking in terms of, you know, your own work, my own work, like, what is the insight that I provide, right? What is the explanatory power of the thing that I am producing, right? Is kind of a major question that I would ask. Okay, so let's actually get into the Rosenbaum.